I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the night. So Adriana Yoder is a Ph.D. student at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Addy started her ongoing research at DePaul University 2 years ago, studying red-headed woodpeckers and oak reproduction in the Chicagoland region. For this research, she was awarded an Illinois Ornithological Society grant, partly funded by the DuPage Birding Club in spring 2023. She's presented her work at several conferences across the United States and Canada. Previously, Addy earned her bachelor's degree from Case Western Reserve University in Biology and Biochemistry, and during her time, she discovered her passion for studying animal behavior. We will hear the details of her research, which centers on the woodpecker's tree cavity use and the role of acorns on their overwintering behavior in northeastern Illinois. So with all of that out of the way, I'll turn it over to Addy. Take it away.
Great. Let me share. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Robert. And like he mentioned, this was research that was funded partially by the DuPage Birding Club, and in this presentation is titled Habitat Characteristics and Seasonality of Red-headed Woodpecker Cavity Use. So starting out broadly, we know birds are in decline in North America. Since about 1970, there's been a decline of about 29% of bird fauna. And a major driver of that is land use change. And a lot of that is caused by humans. So we think of things like urbanization or agriculture. So essentially taking a natural habitat and turning it into something else. And this figure on the right shows the different ecosystems and the decline of birds within each. And then you can see in most ecosystems, there's been a decline. And so within this North American bird fauna is what we call the cavity nesting community. So this includes birds, of course, but also mammals, reptiles, pretty much anything that uses a cavity. And there's kind of two main types of tree cavities. There's excavated tree cavities, which are created primarily by woodpeckers. And you can see that in the bottom left-hand corner. And we also have decay cavities that are created when decay progresses far enough along that a cavity can form. But both of these types of cavities do require some level of decay. Woodpeckers, when they're going to make a cavity, need a dead branch, a dead tree, something in the process of decay. And these tree cavities are used differentially based on the season. So in the breeding season, which would be about spring, summer, these will be used as nest sites. And in the non-breeding season, think fall, winter, they will be used as more shelter or roost sites. And so just to kind of show you how cavities progress through the years, our starting substrate, again, is always a decaying tree. But decay can progress far enough along that potentially a cavity is formed and a cavity nesting species can come in and nest in that cavity. And eventually they'll abandon that cavity and the cavity will be available in the following years for other species to use. Similarly, a woodpecker can come in and excavate a cavity in a decaying tree. That woodpecker species will typically be the ones to nest in that cavity that year, but there is some potential usurpation that can happen. So another cavity nesting species can come in and take over and nest in that. But no matter what, eventually that cavity will be left empty again and available for another species to use, or many species to use in the following years. And this is kind of what makes woodpeckers really important. They create cavities that other species can use. They support the biodiversity by doing this. And so our focal species within this cavity nesting community are red-headed woodpeckers. And you can see their range map here on the right-hand side. And you'll see Illinois outlined in this purple range, which is their year-round range. And within parts of the range, including Illinois, they're known as facultative migrators, which means some individuals will migrate while others will not. And you can see that here as well in this bottom graph. So this was created using eBird data, so observations through eBird. And on the x-axis, we see the months of the year, and on the y-axis, we see observation frequency. And you can see there's a couple peaks in the year, particularly about May and September. And so observations increase during those migratory times. Population kind of levels out during the breeding season, June to August, and then declines going into the winter. But you can see it never really gets to zero in the winter. So some individuals are still left here in Illinois. And the breeding season in Illinois is from about May to August. So some other things to know about red-headed woodpeckers. They have cavity excavation lasts about 12 to 17 days. In that cavity, they'll produce a clutch of about 4 to 7 eggs. Those eggs will be incubated for about 2 weeks. And then if they end up hatching, hatchlings will stay in the cavity for about 24 to 27 days before fledging. And then to know about their diet, in the summer, they are a woodpecker species, which is kind of unusual for them, that they fly catch insects. So it's pretty cool behavior to see. And so I hope you've all been able to see that. And they also make a cool transition where they then switch from eating insects primarily in the summer to caching acorns in the winter. And so you can see here in this image in the middle, a woodpecker caching an acorn. In the bottom here, it's a picture I took of an acorn that I found kind of stashed away behind some bark peeling off a dead tree. And so, like other North American bird fauna, red-headed woodpeckers are in decline. So from 1970 on, there's been about a 67% decline across North America, and in the Great Lakes region, which would include Illinois, there's been about an 88% decline. And again, driving that is primarily land use change. So the destruction of oak savanna habitats, which are their kind of ideal habitat, open canopy for fly catching. And you can see an example of what that would kind of look like in the top here in this image. As well, the lack of available decay. So like I mentioned, decaying trees are really important for their cavity creation. But in areas of urban areas and residential areas, decay and decaying trees are kind of seen as a safety hazard. And so that's typically taken away. But what happens then is that there's lack of substrate for woodpeckers to create cavities. And if they don't have cavities, then they can't reproduce, and other species that need cavities also can't. And so this picture in the bottom right here is of Deer Grove East. There's a pond there. Maybe some of you have been there, that have a ton of dead trees and snags in them. And this is kind of a typical habitat for red-headed woodpeckers, just this level of decay everywhere. And finally, European starlings, they've been shown to potentially usurp cavities at the individual cavity scale, taking over. But looking at the population scale, we don't really see a correlation between them and the decline of red-headed woodpeckers. So maybe just potentially competition at individual cavities every so often. And so going back to this range map, we saw that Illinois was in this year-round range. So we potentially think that we could see red-headed woodpeckers anywhere in Illinois all the time. But if we zoom in on my study area, which again is the Chicagoland region or northeastern Illinois, we see that's actually a pretty patchy distribution. Areas are used year-round, but there's a lot of area that's also just used in the breeding season. And so my research went in to understand why this distribution exists. And so our main hypothesis was about oaks and acorn production. So oaks have what we call massed seeding behavior, and this is the variable production of acorns across years. And it's also synchronous within a population. So for example, this past summer, northern red oaks had a masting year. And then what that means is they produce a ton of acorns. All the individuals, typically all together, the population produces a large amount of acorns. And you can see kind of an example picture here on the right. This isn't a picture I took, but just kind of the level of acorns. You can understand this is what we call a masting year. And then the following years after that, they're kind of below to moderate production of acorns by that species until they hit another masting year. And so what this means for red-headed woodpeckers is that food for them is not evenly distributed across space or time. So between two sites could have different amounts of acorns and therefore different amounts of food, or one site could have a bunch of food, i.e. acorns one year, and then the following years, not as much. And these oaks and acorns can be split into developmental groups. You've probably noticed, or kind of what you know, of visually telling the difference between red and white oaks is that red oaks, their leaves are typically kind of pointed, and the white oaks kind of have rounded lobed leaves. But their acorns are also different in terms of their nutrition and some life history traits. So red oak acorns typically have higher protein and lipids, so they kind of have more energy to give whatever wildlife consumes them, but they also have higher tannins, which potentially make them less palatable to the wildlife that consume them. They mature over 2 years on the tree, and then they germinate the spring after they fall off the tree. They germinate later. This is in contrast to white acorns that have lower proteins and lipids, so potentially less energy content, but they also have lower tannins, which means maybe they're more palatable to the wildlife that consume them. They mature over 1 year on the tree, and the same autumn they fall off the tree, they will begin to germinate. And so with all of this, our objectives were to document the use of breeding only versus year-round habitats of red-headed woodpeckers, and to determine the habitat characteristics that influence their overwintering behavior. And so in the summer of 2023, I located 25 sites over northeastern Illinois. They span north to south about 90 kilometers or about 56 miles. And some of these sites, with the help of you all to find them. So in DuPage, I had West DuPage Forest Preserve, Green Valley Forest Preserve, and Waterfall Glen Forest Preserve. And at each of these cavity sites, I examined them at 4 scales, their habitat at 4 scales. So at the cavity scale, I measured, for example, the height of the cavity. So essentially how far off the ground is the cavity. And then I zoomed out to the cavity tree level. So the tree itself that has the cavity on it, what species is it, if I'm able to tell? Its decay class, so how dead it is. The diameter at breast height, so how big around it is. And then zooming out once more, I went and looked at the immediate habitat around the cavity tree, an 11.3 meter radius plot around the cavity tree. I recorded what other tree species are there, how big around they are in terms of diameter, how decayed are they, and also, for example, measured canopy cover, so how open the canopy is around the cavity tree. Zoomed out once more into a 40 meter radius plot around the cavity tree. And this is where the acorns came into play. So within that 40 meter radius plot, I measured all of the oak trees, their diameters. I determined what species they were. And I also performed on a subset of them acorn counts. And that's kind of essentially what it sounds like. Setting a timer for 30 seconds, using binoculars and counting as many acorns as I can in that amount of time. And this gives a good estimate of how many acorns are at a site, therefore how much food is available, and of what species are these acorns. And so that next winter, to determine if red-headed woodpeckers were still using that cavity, I set up trail cameras, which were set up on adjacent trees, angled to view the cavity. And these trail cameras take pictures based on motion detection. So essentially, we wanted to see if a woodpecker was still using that cavity. And so we determined one was still using it if they either perched at the cavity opening, for example, or if they were seen coming out of the cavity with these pictures. And so I also got some really cool camera trap photos, so I thought I would share a couple of those. But for results, we saw that at 16 of our cavity sites, red-headed woodpeckers were still using those cavities in the winter. And so you can see those as red points on the map. And in about 7 of those cavity sites, they were no longer using those cavities. And so we'd say they're absent in the winter, or those cavities were only used in the breeding season, i.e. the summer before. And so we then took those habitat variables I measured. So things like cavity height, the cavity tree DBH, the density of hard mass trees, which would be things like oaks and hickories, the density of dead trees, and also the number of acorns, either total or split into those 2 developmental groups, red and white. And these were kind of thrown into a model. And we found that acorns were the key characteristic determining if red-headed woodpeckers continued to use a cavity into the winter. And so those would be kind of the results I show here. And so this graph is showing the total acorn quantity. And on the x-axis, we have the winter presence or absence. So absent if they were no longer using the cavity, present if they were still using the cavity in the winter. And on the y-axis, we have the number of acorns. And you can see between these 2 groups, the variation of acorn quantity is quite different. In the absent group, we see that the acorn quantity is generally lower. And then versus in the present group, there's much wider distribution, but we see that anywhere there's high numbers of acorns, red-headed woodpeckers always continue to use those cavities into the winter. And so then if we split those into the red developmental group and white developmental group, we see that red acorns have a similar distribution to what we saw in the total. Between absent and presence, there's quite a difference in variability of amount of acorns. Where they're absent in the winter, always kind of low number of red acorns, versus in the present, if they were present at the cavity, wherever there was high numbers of red acorns, they were always present. This is in contrast to the white acorns, where these distributions aren't that different from each other. There's kind of variability in all of it. And so we didn't see much difference in terms of white acorns if red-headed woodpeckers stayed and used a cavity or not. And so the kind of conclusions then we can draw from my study are that acorns affect red-headed woodpecker winter cavity use. And any sites where there were high acorn quantities, red-headed woodpeckers always continued to use those cavities, specifically when high numbers of red acorns were present. And so that kind of leads us to the question of potentially why red oak acorns. And so my kind of hypotheses right now are that those red oak acorns have that high nutrition, so high lipids, high proteins. So they have a lot of energy to give the wildlife that consume them in the winter. And they also have that high tannin content, and tannins have been known to have antimicrobial effects. So potentially they are able to last the winter and that storage period better than potentially white acorns could. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of you for both funding and also whenever I ask, has anyone seen any red-headed woodpecker cavities? Some people generally say, yes, of course I have. And they kind of been able to aid me in finding my cavity sites. And what's cool is that the research actually continues. So like Robert mentioned, I started this research at DePaul and moved here to University of Missouri, and this will become kind of PhD work. And so I'm going to get a couple more years of data collected, which will be great in terms of knowing those acorns are variable across years. And so having multiple years of data just kind of strengthens whatever relationship we've seen. So this past summer, I located about 29 cavity sites this time, measured all the habitat characteristics, counted all the acorns, and I'm currently planning to set up those cameras this winter, and then next year do it all over again. And then if I can ask of all of you, just to keep making iNaturalist observations whenever you see red-headed woodpeckers. They're great for GPS coordinates, and it's kind of most useful. So if you're able to, please do, and make them year round. So if you see any this fall, winter, or next summer, I'd be happy to see them. And feel free to always email me if you want to let me know that way. I wish this email was a little bit more memorable than it is, but it is there, and Robert also has it. And with that, thank you, and I will take any questions.
All right, Addy. Turn that back on. All right, Addy, thank you very, very much. Does anybody in here have any questions? Yes. So the question was, when the woodpeckers store acorns, will other birds find them and steal them?
There is potential for that, yes. I've never actually quantified it myself, but there's definitely sources stating that is a possibility.
Yes. So the question was, the birds that nest in those cavities, do they come back year after year, or do new birds use those nests?
Great question. So in terms of different species can use those nests, it has been shown that red-headed woodpeckers can use the same cavities kind of breeding season after breeding season. Particularly for my research, because I didn't, for example, band these birds, I don't know different individuals from each other. So I can't say for sure they're the same individuals. Actually, from 2023 to 2024, I didn't have any red-headed woodpeckers still using a cavity. So that was kind of interesting. It seems maybe they just prefer to make new here potentially, but with more years of data, maybe we'll see something else.
Question, yes.
Just a question for you. Are you aware of the oak? Or the Chicago wilderness? It would be very interested in your research.
Dan, why don't you come up and ask that question? Watch out with the cords.
Yeah.
So my question is whether you're aware of the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Project, which is part of the Chicago Wilderness Initiative. I think they would be very interested in your research because their whole initiative is to restore oak ecosystems in the region. So I have your email address, or I can get it. And
yes, please let me
connect you with
know.
those.
I did not know.
Yeah, yeah, I think they'd be very interested in your research.
Yes, please do. Thank you.
All right, anybody else? Okay. Elma, did you have something? I'll look at chat. Yeah, so the question is, do you know, I don't know about percentage, but do the birds find a majority of the acorns that they store, or are they like squirrels and forget right after they bury it?
I don't personally know from my data collection, but some site sources say that they're not the best at finding them, like and so yeah.
So a couple of questions from the chat. Will you continue to search for cavities in the area? And I guess more broadly, how do you find these cavities?
Yeah. So yes, I will next summer be doing the same thing, looking for cavities within DuPage Lake and Cook counties. Sorry, what was the second part of the question? Oh, how do I find them?
Yeah, how do you find them?
Yeah, so help from some of you all. I located some, I used eBirds just to see, you know, where are their sightings, and then I kind of go out and I might actually use the callback method. So you may know that red-headed woodpeckers are pretty territorial. So if you play even just, you know, the call for 30 seconds, usually some of them will respond. And I kind of can locate them that way, and then from there find their cavities. And I also have a collaborator at the Illinois Natural History Survey, and she also has been doing red-headed woodpecker stuff. And so we're going to kind of combine our data that way. I find the cavities, and she kind of has some other acorn data.
Another question here, did you notice any correlation between the number of mammals, such as squirrels and deer, who consume acorns and the presence or absence of woodpeckers?
Great question. I have not collected that data, so I do not know, but that would be definitely interesting.
And another one here, do year-old birds stay and help the parents with any future fledglings?
I do not believe so. No, they kind of go out on their own. They can start to breed, you know, that following summer. So kind of go out on their own.
I guess a couple questions I had. Are so you said that you're going to stay in the area and look for cavities in the area. Are you going to expand the locations, or are you going to kind of stick with the locations you have already?
Yeah, I'm gonna most likely stick with these 3 counties. Potentially maybe find some down here in St. Louis, and I can kind of do a comparison situation. But for right now, it's just kind of within those 3 counties still.
And then I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but I know, sorry, another question came in. I know that the population has declined. I believe Illinois removed them from the endangered species list because they are coming back. Any idea why they seem to be increasing?
Yeah, I can't say for sure, but I know there's, you know, most of the forest reserves I've been going to have been kind of putting into motion like restoration projects. I think Venus Woods is one of my sites, and this past winter they just totally winter into spring they did a whole clear out, and so really opened up the understory and canopy. And so I think there's just been more restoration aimed at kind of bringing back this more open canopy habitat. That's kind of my initial hypothesis.
Yeah. I guess regarding recent things that happened here over the summer, do red-headed woodpeckers eat cicadas? And would that have helped their food supply this year?
Yeah, they do. I watch them eat a lot of cicadas. So they definitely do. I did collect some cicada data. So, oh, that's fun. Cicada data. I did collect some of that. So that's something I can potentially apply after this year. Yeah.
You mentioned that they were territorial. Do you know how large their territories can be? So someone asked, can there be more than one nest in a 17-acre forest?
Yeah, for sure. I know winter territories can get up to like 1 hectare, which is like 2-something acres. I think summer territories can get a little bigger than that, but I definitely think there could be multiple in 17 hectare. That pond I mentioned in Deer Grove East, even just because there's so many snags in it, there's usually multiple pairs. So it's really kind of the territory size can kind of contract and expand.
Any other questions in here? Yes.
So,
So the question was, do the acorn trees, I guess, produce acorns every year, or could it be every other year?
So it's typically, you know, they'd have these masting years, so the population would produce a lot of acorns, and so that mass seeding is kind of at a population scale. So individuals can kind of do their own thing-ish. And typically they maybe don't produce nothing, but maybe, you know, fewer acorns one year, next year's more. Yeah, it's pretty variable.
Do you know if red-headed woodpeckers mate for life, or is it a different mate every season?
I believe it's a different mate every season. They are like technically, or they call it monogamous for a season, but I think they do change. It's not a for life thing.
Yes, another question.
They're all looking at whether in summer and winter.
So the question is, do you think that some of these woodpeckers are moving to the same individual, but moving to a different cavity from, let's see, say breeding season to the winter? Are they staying in the same area, just going to different cavities, or do you have any idea about that?
Yeah. So part of this facultative migration is that they kind of move variable distances. So it is possible that, you know, some from the north, so say one leaves a cavity here and maybe one from the north comes down and takes over a cavity. We don't know for sure. Again, we're not tracking individuals. And that's kind of another reason I can't say, you know, one is the same woodpecker is staying year after year or through the winter, but that a red-headed woodpecker is still using it. But yeah.
Do the woodpeckers in Illinois have more than one brood per nesting season?
Yeah, some of them can. Typically, I think 2 is kind of the max in Illinois.
Any other questions in here? Right, I'm not seeing any in here or on the chat. So, Addy, thank you very much for speaking with us. So yeah, if people do have any sightings or anything, just keep putting them to eBird, iNaturalist, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I guess we'll give you another round of applause.
Yeah. Thank you all for having me. It's been great.
All right, Addy, thank you very much.